Hi, my name is Sam Nicaise, and I'm an electrical engineering PhD student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And today I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing with my coworkers, where we've been looking at the templated growth of zinc oxide nanowires and a couple of the morphological understandings and how to control them, as well as the applications. So to jump right in, why are we looking at this research? And to show you the world here, this is my representation of what is impacting our world is something called global warming. You probably have heard about it and some of the human contributions of that towards global warming with the burning of fossil fuels. Now, the energy that we get in the world doesn't all have to come from fossil fuels. A lot of it can come from renewable resources. And here I pictured a PV array. And that's specifically because solar energy can be converted from, in the solar form, towards electrical engineering that humans can use. And this is done through, one of the means is through photovoltaic solar cells. Now, to give you an idea of what we can do with PV or photovoltaics to mitigate global warming, I want to throw some numbers at you. So first, the sun gives us a lot of energy. About 82 petawatts on average is hitting the Earth. And that's a lot more than what humans are going to use. And I live in America, so I look at it in terms of what the U.S. might want to do with it. And the U.S., being about 1 or 2% of the world land mass, receives 1.5 petawatts of energy on average. That's still a lot. And to put that in context, the U.S. actually only produces about 33 megawatts on average of solar electricity, solar alone. And so 33 megawatts is a lot less than 1.5 petawatts. It's actually somewhere around 8 orders of magnitude. So imagine, we have the potential of increasing our solar electricity generation by 8 orders of magnitude. That would easily cover all of the energy that we would need as a country. So with that idea in mind, there's a lot of potential there. Every little bit of technology can help bridge that gap, bridge that 8 order of magnitude gap. And so that's what I'd like to target today with the presentation on what we've been doing with zinc oxide solar cells. Now they have the potential to meet that PV gap. And there's a lot of good aspects about zinc oxide as a solar cell material. One is that there's some good high performance material. And I'll talk about that more later. Also, it can be applied to many different substrates, so it's very versatile. And from a manufacturing perspective, there's a lot of benefits like low temperature processing and solution-based fabrication, which are great. In the research world, a lot has gone into trying to understand the potential of zinc oxide in solar cells, and we've actually created some solar cells that have incredibly high efficiency and have potential for much higher, well beyond 10%, which would be great for actual commercialization of these solar cells. And here I've got an image, 2 of them, one of a 3D array and one of a 2D stack of what a possible zinc oxide solar cell could look like. In this stack, the solar irradiation is coming from the bottom and transmitting through the glass and through the transparent conducting oxide, which is an electrode, also through the zinc oxide layer to the active material, in this case, which is colloidal quantum dots. And the magic happens here, and then we've also got a back contact here. And as doing electrical engineering, one of the things that we can control is the geometry of this solar cell. And that's important because an example like this, the active material, the quantum dots, absorb all of the sunlight. And if this layer is too thin, it actually won't absorb all of the incoming light. And some of it will be reflected back out. So we actually need to increase the thickness of this layer to make it thicker so that it absorbs all the light. And that's a simple way of showing how controlling geometry can help for the charge collection. Specifically, we're looking at zinc oxide nanowires and how they can benefit PV performance. So with this similar stack, I'd like to suggest a reason for why you might want nanowires. And you can consider what would happen when light comes into this solar cell. It's going to be absorbed in the quantum dot layer. Now, if the light is absorbed close to this zinc oxide nanowire interface, down here we'll create an exciton. And this exciton can then move towards this heterojunction, and the charges can separate. Electrons and holes can separate, and that will produce photocurrent. Now, if the light's absorbed further up into this quantum dot layer, it's actually the case that the exciton can't make it to this heterojunction, and therefore the electron hole will recombine. And that won't contribute to photocurrent and will reduce the efficiency of the solar cell. So to mitigate this issue, we can actually use nanowires. And nanowires extend the zinc oxide interface up into the active material. And in this case, both the excitons in the lower portion and the upper portion of the quantum dot layer can be separated. In this case, just like it was before. In the other case, the excitons can actually move to the closest nanowire. In those cases, all of the generated excitons produce photocurrent. And so this is the idea of using a nanostructured zinc oxide array so that we can collect more photocurrent and increase the efficiency of this cell. So in controlling the nanowire array, there's a couple questions you may ask. What pitch would we want for these nanowires, the separation between them? And so if the pitch is too low, we actually run into an issue. And this is based on some previous research. This is a top-down micrograph of some zinc oxide nanowires, and actually the density is extremely high, and the pitch is very low. And when this is used for a solar cell, as you can see in this case, the infiltration of quantum dots is difficult. So the quantum dots have difficulty getting in between the zinc oxide nanowires, as you can see here, or in between here. And they also create voids where there are no quantum dots, producing electronic inefficiencies. So these issues would suggest that you don't want too low of a pitch. Now, you probably also don't want too high of a pitch. In this case, you're going to produce excitons that are also too far away from the zinc oxide heterojunction, and therefore can't be separated and will be recombined. So that also won't contribute to the photocurrent. So this idea of pitch has been theorized and also looked at experimentally in other systems. And it's been shown that there is an ideal pitch at which all of the excitons that are generated in this quantum dot layer can therefore move and be separated to the closest nanowire. So the nanowires aren't spaced too far apart, but we're not getting the issue of infiltration. And it suggested that a pitch between 250 and 300 nanometers is the ideal pitch for the nanowires. So with this research in mind, we said, well, let's take what we had before, which was a dense array of nanowires, and template where the nanowires are going to be. And that's what we thought to do. Using a growth mask that's produced with lithography, we specifically decided through templating where the nanowires are going to be. And here you can see a prime example of that. This is a 45-degree tilt of one of our experimental results of a nanowire array that's been templated so that the specific position of each nanowire has been engineered through the growth mask. Here you can see it is templated at a pitch that we chose of 276 nanometers, in between 250 and 300. And the nanowires were masked with a templating growth mask like this, which are holes that sit on top of the substrate. I'll describe that more later. And then you can see a top-down micrograph of what this array looks like from the top down. You can see that we've got a good separation between each of the nanowires for quantum dot infiltration, but they're not too far apart that they won't generate photocharge. So how do we make this? Well, I'll describe the basic process to you. On the substrate, first we deposit a zinc oxide seed layer. And the seed layer is used to produce the nanowires from which the nanowires are grown. And it's either annealed or not annealed. Now, if we don't have a growth mask, we actually get nanowires growing all over the place through a hydrothermal growth process. And they grow mostly perpendicular off of the substrate from that seed layer. And that's great for many of the reasons that I suggested earlier, and this is why we would want to do hydrothermal growth of zinc oxide. But there's actually the issue that if you don't have a growth mask, the nanowires are too dense. So we went about doing this process with a growth mask, and we made the growth mask on top of the zinc oxide seed layer with electron beam lithography. So we applied electron beam lithography resist, and then went about the templating process of patterning holes into that resist. And those holes expose the underlying seed layer. And then with the hydrothermal growth process, the nanos were then grown through those holes in a templated fashion. And finally, the resist was removed to leave behind only zinc oxide, either the seed layer or the nanowires. So this process was great because it allowed us to target the 276 nanometer ideal pitch, which we're looking at to extract all the photocurrent for meeting this PV potential. And we realize there's a number of other experimental process parameters that we can control here, which will also control what happens with the nanowires and the morphology of the nanowires. And so to outline a few of those, one, we looked at a number of different substrates. As I said before, zinc oxide can be applied to different substrates. We look at PEN, which is a flexible plastic, polyethylene naphthalate. We also look at a photovoltaic applicable rigid substrate, glass with a coating of indium tin oxide as the transparent conductive oxide, and then also the very standard silicon substrate. We varied two different process parameters. We either deposited the zinc oxide seed layer by spin coating or sputter coating, and also we either left that seed layer neat or annealed it thermally at 400 degrees for 2 hours. And lastly, the templating mask exposed via electron beam lithography. The holes in that mask were varied from 30 to 20 nanometers in diameter, and that was done through varying the dose of the electrons that was applied to each hole. And so there's a number of examples that I'll show you here of the arrays that we achieved. So for the flexible, flashy plastic substrate, we were able to template exactly where the nanowires were going to be. Though we've still got some work left to do to figure out how to increase the yield where we're actually missing a lot of the nanowires. So most of the work in this, though we did achieve templating of this nanowire array, most of the work in this experiment was done on either ITO coated glass, as you can see here, an example, or on silicon. And so we can get better results with ITO coated glass, possibly even better if we sputter coat the zinc oxide instead of spin it. And some of our best results came from silicon substrates that had a sputtered and annealed zinc oxide seed layer. Now, in many cases, we saw great results of a single templating hole producing a single nanowire. And you can see an example of that here. We were specifically able to decide where the nanowires were going to grow, but we also saw a lot of other characteristics of the nanowire arrays which might not be preferential for photovoltaic application or other applications. And those specifically were morphology such as branching and pore alignment. And I'll go into these two things for the rest of the presentation, as that's what we've analyzed primarily. So to start off with branching, we saw that for a single templating hole, in many cases we got a single nanowire, and that was called non-branched. Though in other cases, a single templating hole produced many nanowires. And that was considered branched. And so for each array, we calculated the number of non-branched nanowires versus the total templating holes and considered this to be the degree of non-branching for that specific array. And we calculated this for all of the arrays and paired this metric with the array-specific measured hole diameters. And we plotted the results, as you can see here. And so on the x-axis, we've got the measured templating hole diameter, or the growth mask hole diameter. And we bin them by 10 nanometer increments so that for clarity's sake. And then the y-axis, we've got the degree of non-branching. And we separate it for silicon substrates and ITO glass substrates. I'll give you a few examples of some of the analysis that we figured out. One of the primary results was that as you increase the templating hole diameter, you decrease the branching. You can see by this negative slope here. And so that was for all the processing parameters. Furthermore, annealing was very important. As we anneal the zinc oxide seed layers, we go from more branched to less branched. That was the case with many of them. And so to understand this annealing approach, we actually took a better look at the seed layers. And you can see why we would want to do that here. Here's an SEM micrograph and an unannealed seed layer with a lot of branching. You can see many nanowires branching from each other, compared to an annealed seed layer where we have very little branching. And mind you, that otherwise all of the process parameters are held constant. And so you can see the difference between unannealed and annealed in terms of branching. And we've investigated this further by looking at the seed layers. These are SEM micrographs and AFM micrographs of the seed layers before nanowire growth. And you can see that from unannealed to annealed, we actually get an increase in the nanowire, or the zinc oxide seed grain in the size of it, the diameter from here to here. And that was very important because what we're looking at when we're masking this seed layer is that the templating hole actually exposes a number of grains. And so for this case here, this cartoon here, many of these different grains can actually grow and protrude their own individual nanowires, possibly branching nanowires. Though in this cartoon here, we've got very fewer grains being exposed, and so therefore there's less likelihood that we'll have as many nanowires. So that was very much the case that we saw experimentally, and we realized that we can control either the templating diameter, how big this hole is, or how big the grains are by controlling annealing, and by doing that, we're able to also control the degree of branching. So this is very important because by controlling branching, we're suggesting that this morphology could possibly inhibit PV performance, so we want to mitigate it as much as possible. So that's it for branching. Alignment was the other issue, other morphology that we saw a lot of. And alignment is the angle of the nanowires that's not normal to the substrate. So as you can see here, we have a nanowire that's mostly normal to the substrate, or in this case, we've got nanowires that are mostly parallel to the substrate. And we measured alignment with something called the order parameter, which is proportional to the cosine of this angle. And the order parameter, or S, was measured either high, close to 1, or low, as a minimum would be negative 0.5. And we measured this for every nanowire in an array and averaged it and got the metric of the order parameter for that specific array compared to, again, the templating mask hole diameter. And so we plotted those. Again, here's the templating hole diameter on the x-axis, and the alignment parameter, close to 1 is good, on the y-axis, and for all the different processing conditions. And some of the analysis I'll tell you about is that for this nuance-specific processing parameter here, spin coating the zinc oxide on silicon, it was very dependent on hole diameter. As you increase the hole diameter, positively, you get better alignment. But otherwise, many of them were independent of templating hole diameter. And that was because they're mostly very well aligned. All of the nanors were well aligned, so there was less dependence on the hole diameter itself. So that was great. And also beyond that, annealing did help for most of the parameters. As we went from non-annealed in red to annealed in green, we got better alignment. So through these changes, templating hole diameter, choice of the substrate and annealing conditions, we were able to say that, well, we can actually produce pretty well-ordered or highly aligned nanowires. And that was great for PV application. So we've learned that a number of the different knobs that we've got are able to control the morphology of the nanowires. And all of this is looking back at what we can do to meet that PV potential so that we can mitigate some of our human impact on the world and get all of our energy possibly, or a large portion of our energy from the sun. Remember, 8 orders of magnitude separates of what we're doing to what we could potentially do in a perfect world. And that's well beyond what we would ever need for human consumption. And we can do that, at least in this system, by looking at a number of the different process parameters, namely the hole diameter that we use to template these nanowires, controlling the size of the grains, in our case through thermal annealing, or understanding what matters when we're looking at the alignment. So I'd like to leave you with this image of the world and what potential we have to impact it as with the technology that we're looking at. Because really, zinc oxide solar cells have a lot of benefit if they can meet that potential. Now, I do want to say there are a lot of other applications that this research can be applied to, because you may want to control the morphology of the zinc oxide nanowire or array for a lot of other exciting things that are being researched. A couple examples here are mechanical generators where motion or vibrations actually produce electricity with a zinc oxide nanowire array. Furthermore, if you want to take those zinc oxide nanowires and use them for other devices, you may want to transfer them to a different substrate, and understanding the direction and the morphology of the nanowires in that case would be very important. And lastly, a lot of research is going into surface energy engineering. So in cases where you want to create super hydrophobicity, where water does not stay on a substrate at all, you want nanowires to go in every different direction. So you would want to increase misalignment. So that could be applied to this application. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank all my co-authors for this paper. and also a lot of the other people at MIT who have contributed significantly to the ideas and the research. These are the two labs that the authors work in, as well as like to thank our funding agencies, the MIT Energy Initiative, as well as the fellowship program with the NSF. I hope you enjoyed, and looking forward to receiving any questions via email. Thank you.